This office that you are filming in, Sparky moved into it in 1972. Everything here was new. It wasn't quite as big as it is today. And it had, maybe 5 employees in it. So it was a very small office that Sparky worked in. And his business space, his drawing space, probably 15 square feet, I'm guessing. The rest of it was his books and memorabilia, gifts people gave him that surrounded him every day.
The place itself, I think we mentioned, it's very unassuming. I mean, it looks like a dentist's office. You'd think, there was a practice here as opposed to a world-famous cartoonist.
I think what happened is really in the 60s, the comic strip had really grown to, I think, kind of the height of its success. It was new, it was fresh, it was worldwide. There was a lot going on, so as it rolled into the 70s, it had so much momentum going.
When I look back on it, I think, oh my gosh, we really had a lot of fun. We have a tennis court here. Friends came and played tennis with them. We had the baseball field. We used to have an arena baseball team, and I played on the women's softball team, and Sparky loved it. He loved all those sports.
He identified with things that a lot of us had long forgotten in our childhood. Sparky always said that there would always be a market for innocence in this country. I think he looked at himself as a common man, talking to common men and women. He used to joke that he was a humble egotist, which kind of combined his humbleness and his creativity. And basically, he dealt with eternal ideas that came long before him and will go long after him.
What I know of Sparky's work is he didn't really make pointed commentary in his strip directly. If anything, if there was commentary, it would have been veiled. And he sort of did things in a subtle way, and so that's why I think we can sort of read it today and still get it to resonate.
People always revert back to what they are and what their nature is, and I think people want to laugh and they want to have hope, and I think that's what people saw in the strip and I think responded to.
Well, when it comes to writers and rituals, I don't think my dad would have what you would call a ritual. Some people are kind of fanatical like that. They have to be in their place, not their time, and so forth. Really, what he would say when he works is that really he was dedicated to his craft, so his ritual really would have been coming to work every day, putting in a good 8 hours worth of work, and some days he would sit here for 8 hours and create absolutely nothing. Other days he would get a sequence of strips going that would lead from one to the next, and he might be able to knock out a week's worth of work, in that day.
His thought processes went on all the time. They went on when he was driving to work, when he was sitting in the symphony, when he was in the arena having lunch, watching people. But it was interesting because we used to sit and listen to all of the news coming out about Nixon and the Watergate trial, and yet he would turn around and go back to his desk and draw a peanut strip.
He says that when you're a really professional cartoonist, that there really are no such things as a dry spell. If you need to create, you can create. And the nice thing about his comic strip really was that he had such a vast array of characters that he had a full keyboard to play with it. So the way he would work is he'd sit down at his desk, for example, and if he wanted to think of an idea, he would take a scratch pad out and he would just start drawing.
Strangely enough, most of my ideas come simply by sitting here at the drawing board and perhaps doodling around on this little pad of paper.
As opposed to going straight to the artboard and drawing, he would just start to doodle and come up with different sketches and ideas, and that's, I think, where a lot of his more avant-garde storylines came from. Just, a fun sketch of Snoopy doing something totally bizarre would lead to weeks' worth of storylines.
Actually, the equipment of a cartoonist is just absurdly simple. Really, all you need is about 4 or 5 pens and a pencil. That's about it, besides a ruler and the drawing board and a bottle of ink.
His pen choice was famous. It was mythology among cartoonists because he had a very specific pen tip he used. It was a Radio 914 Esterbrook steel quill tip. Has a very flexible end, but it is steel, so you have to put a little bit of pressure on the paper to get the variation of line that he liked. Old school, think about the old school pen that you dip in an inkwell.
It wasn't really a drawing pen per se, it was a writing pen.
Like I said, it actually has body and volume on the paper. It's really interesting to look at the originals. One of the things that he was particularly good at was rain. Using that steel tip pen, if he did not have this hot press paper, this would have probably made the ink bleed in some cases, but as you can see, it's very crisp. But it's a challenge in a medium that's all stark black and white to create rain and background and not overwhelm your characters with the line work. Nothing in the comic was computerized or mechanical in any way. It was all done by hand.
What I see a lot in new cartoonists is that they'll just grab any old particular font from their computer and just throw it in and you get something ugly like Comic Sans. So he was really versatile. He was able to do cursive, to mimic a kid's handwriting, or those awful times when Charlie Brown is trying to be a pen pal and he smudges the paper. That's all authentic.
And then for lettering outrageous outbursts, he used a C5, which has a much more rounded point, so he can get the bolder line. So this would have been an example where he used the C5 pen point with the rounded tip to do where she's yelling, "You're what?" And here it is, Marcy saying, "I'm not going, sir," calling him sir. Then he would have roughed in the black work with a brush, and then he would have done all this detail work with the 914 pen.
When he caught wind that the story goes, when he heard that this company was going to go out of business, he bought up the entire supply of pens and pen nibs, so he could, use them forevermore.
Good grief!
In the mid to late 90s, the Strathmore stopped making the style of paper that he was using.
What am I going to do, lawyers?
He had quite a stash of it. Once he got to a certain level of success, one of the things you like the least is having to line off the squares for the comic, and so he had those pre-printed on the boards, so he could get right to the fun part of just drawing the characters.
Sparky loved to draw, and he loved to draw funny drawings.
Well, I think anybody that really studies the comic strip will notice a distinct difference between the 60s and the 70s. And I think what happens is in the 60s, you got to remember he had 5 kids that were growing up. There's a lot of interaction between the children and the families, and not to say we were violent or anything, but I think he took that and put that in the comic strip. So that's when you get a lot of the motions, a lot of the kids hitting each other.
The strip is populated with these great moments of kinetic energy and pen slashes flying across, and Charlie Brown getting beamed by the baseball after he pitches it and his clothes fly off.
By the 70s, his life had softened, and I think you see that in the comic strip. The comic strip definitely softened by the 70s.
He said one day he realized that he was in the comic strip, he was the writer, the producer, the set designer, everything, and he could do whatever he wanted. And this kinetic energy was perfect in the strip and unique to the comic strip, and also gave us as animators a tremendous leeway to do stuff that hadn't been done in animation before.
He really starts to experiment a little bit more with storytelling and what the characters can do. In particular, Peppermint Patty really comes into her own. She appears in the strip, and I think her first appearance is '66. So she's around for a while, but in the 70s in particular, she just explodes.
Sparky was always ahead of his time in regard to women's issues. I remember this was a big breakthrough. One of the great things about the comic strip, it was always growing, always bringing in new people to the repertory company. So then he had Peppermint Patty, and then of course Marcy comes along, showing Peppermint great respect, calling him sir and so forth and so on. And that was a very important transition for us in animation, to have new characters to brighten up the shows in the 70s.
We're not going to play around with those guys out there today. Our basic play will be me smashing straight ahead and crunching out the yarns.
Peppermint Patty is excels at all the things that Charlie Brown does not. She's a great athlete. Everybody likes her. Outside of school, she's the ace on the block. She and Charlie Brown are actually, I think, the perfect couple. Charlie Brown just doesn't know it.
Visita mi canal.
I think Sparky would have said that the one character that evolved more than any other up to the 70s would have been Snoopy.
Well, I think Snoopy's a fascinating character because it's easy to look at Snoopy now with all his personas and so forth, but you've got to reflect back onto somebody starting the comic strip. If, for example, in the 1950s, my dad would have had Snoopy come out, stand on his back legs, and fantasize about being the flying ace or some of these other things, that could have been disastrous for the comic strip. So in essence, Snoopy had to evolve as a child would evolve. And then the big event was really when my dad came up with the idea of the flying ace versus the Red Baron. When that happened, that just triggered and opened the door for all these great fantasies that Snoopy could, and personas he could morph into.
Snoopy definitely takes the cake for evolution. It all kind of starts with, behaving almost like a human. But because he's not human, he can go into these great sequences.
Sparky's imagination just took off.
There goes the Red Baron again.
Before his strip, they were very literal. If you were natives on a desert island, you were drawn as natives on a desert island, or if you were shipwrecked, you were shipwrecked. And what he did was he took a character who never actually got off the top of his doghouse. And so by doing that, he sort of broke through this fourth wall. And he let you imagine with Snoopy. This comic would not be nearly as funny if you saw a dog acting like a dog running around an actual skating rink. But the fact that he simply has a hockey stick and he's running around on top of his doghouse yelling at the top of his lungs, that's funny. That's funny. He's letting you in on the joke, in on the imaginary hockey rink that he's playing in.
Whatever he did, he knew the essence of it was the bottom line. It had to be funny. The bottom line is he knew that Snoopy doing these things was really funny. The drawings and themselves could be funny. Snoopy, as an attorney, Snoopy is flying ace, Snoopy is whatever. They were funny drawings to begin with, and I think that's really what carries it. If you don't have a funny drawing, the joke necessarily doesn't really hold up on itself. They need to work together.
He often said Charlie Brown was who he was, but Snoopy was who he would have liked to have been. So Joe Cool would be Sparky's idea of what he would have been in college if he could have thrown off his Charlie Brownness, put on the glasses because you have to hide behind something, and then hang around looking for chicks.
All of us cartoonists sit around and try to imagine what it would have been like for Mr. Schultz, aka Sparky, back in the day, because no one saw licensing, no one had been licensed the way that his characters were licensed.
Licensing was just beginning and people were beginning to do plastic molds. It was sometimes difficult to get things to look good, but amazingly enough, they did a pretty good job. Things like this bubble tub, but then people wanted to get away from plastic and go back to the wooden toys. So then we had a selection of little wooden toys, carved toys. And you can see it's very cute, but it just has a little sticker for Snoopy in the window and so forth. And this was done by Aviva, who is a local fellow who lived in Palo Alto. Of course now, just because a lot of them are getting older, we've been able to, some of them have given the museum their collections.
It's funny because people assume that since he's no longer doing the comic strip, that there's nothing to do here at the studio, or maybe the studio's not, active and alive. But what people should realize is that if a character is beloved, like Snoopy is or Charlie Brown, they have a life of their own apart from the creator.
Being a cartoonist is a fascinating life in that you or your characters can be world famous, but you're sitting in a little room day after day drawing these comic strips, and of course he drew 18,000 of them. he never had anybody else work on the strip or draw it or do any of the lettering, because he said that would be like Arnold Palmer having someone hit his 9 irons for him.
I think somehow he was able to tap into some sort of universal experience. He managed to come up with a character that resonated as much for a mom in Ohio as a schoolgirl in Japan. I mean, how do you do that? I don't know.
Well, I think when people tried to analyze Sparky's work and say, well, you're a great philosopher, and he would, and we quote this now around the studio all the time when people get too heavy about it, and we say, Sparky would say, it's a comic strip, you know, like, lighten up. Don't take it so seriously. But in fact, I think he was a philosopher. It was common sense, but that's what a lot of philosophy is. It's thoughtfulness about common sense and thoughtfulness about human emotions. I think Sparky didn't actually realize what a great philosopher he was.
I think a lot of it is that he was such a great observer of life. Life was new and exciting, and things were changing. But it is interesting, and I wish I could ask him.